Hi everyone, I'm Trent Kusters from League of Geeks, and this, once again, is the Game Maker's Notebook. Welcome back. Today, I had a great chat with a couple of folks from Polyarc. They are the creators of Moss Book 1, and recently, by the time this podcast has been published, they will have released Moss Book 2 on Quest 2. You can also grab it on PSVR, but I spoke to a couple of folks from there. I spoke to Chris Alderson, art director and co-founder, and also Josh Stiksma, the design director of Moss Book 2. We had some wonderful chats. We covered a lot of topics, but we spoke about how Moss Book 1's original E3 demo helped define and help Polyarc hone in on the seminal VR experience that we know and love today. We also spoke about the art and design choices that they use to help build that relationship and bond that we all know and love with Quill, the game's protagonist. And then, of course, the difference in balancing player agency for Moss's VR dioramas as opposed to your typical puzzle platformers. And then we wrapped up with some comments on their recent scaling and what it's like running a VR studio in 2022. It was a wonderful chat. Moss is a wonderfully unique game, and I implore you all to check out the game. But before that, have a listen to this episode.
There's no turning back now. Or so the saying goes. You've come too far on this journey. A million moments of calm and chaos. Of triumph and heartbreak. It all led you to this. But when the fear within threatens to consume you, it's the real heroes who do turn back. To see the ones who stand behind them. Who give them the strength to achieve the impossible.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Game Maker's Notebook. I'm Trent Kusters. We have a couple of very special guests with us here today. We have Josh Stiksma, who's design director on Moss 2 over at Polyarc. And we also have Chris Alderson, co-founder and art director over there. How are you guys?
Doing well.
Wow.
Yeah. What time is it over there?
It's fresh and early. It's like 8:10 a.m. in the morning.
Okay.
So
Oh.
the West Coast is an easy one to sync up with. It's my favorite meetings with folks at the West Coast. And when the meetings are podcasts, it's even better.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us today, guys. I've been
Thanks for having
playing.
us.
Yeah, I've played Moss 1. I've been playing Moss 2. It's an exciting time. Why don't we dive into it by giving everyone a little bit of an idea of how Polyarc sort of got to this point of Moss 2. So usually we do, how'd you get into games? But there's two of you here today. So why don't we, Chris, give us the rundown on how Polyarc found their way doing book 2 of Moss.
Yeah. So I'll kind of give the Cliff's notes of our history. We set off about 7 years ago. A lot of us came from the studio Bungie, and we all sort of fell in love with VR around the same time. Valve was across the street, and a lot of us were able to go there and do a bunch of their demos on the Vive. And we just kind of fell in love with the medium, and we knew that there was something here. There was this fresh new take on games, the thing we've all been doing for some of us nearly a couple decades. And it was a way to sort of reinvigorate ourselves in electronic medium. And we learned a few things from early demos, like areas we wanted to explore and areas that we wanted to stay away from. And some of the, a lot of studios were doing big and bombastic and action titles and roller coaster rides and everything. And then a small subset of those studios were doing these very small and like tight knit, small world demos where you could like look over these little communities of characters. And we figured that, maybe we're not the studio yet to tackle, some of the people were getting motion sickness and, people, there was a lot of just like a lot of trends that we could already see really early on. And, a lot of us had been making shooters and action games and zombie horror games and all sorts of action titles. And it was, I think, time for a lot of us to do something that was maybe a little bit more soft and kind. And in a lot of ways that laid the groundwork for where we went and what we became. This whole new medium of, this brand new.
It's amazing, isn't it? I remember that moment. I remember that time that you were talking about. I remember getting the special demo at Valve when they were doing the secret VR stuff, and they had that room and there were like cables coming down from the top. It looked like something out of a Cronenberg film.
Yeah.
And it was really special. There was the demo. I think the first thing that I did was the blue, that whale demo. And you have this moment of
like a cool one.
Yeah, like, oh, this is super, super special. So, Josh, now obviously I've mentioned Moss Book 1 and Book 2. We're here because the release of Moss Book 2 is coming up on the Quest. Might already be out by the time this podcast airs. But why don't we give everyone just sort of like a highline read of what Moss Book 2 is, Josh? Explain it for our users.
Yeah, I mean,
users, look at the game developer.
I mean, it's hard to jump right into Moss 2 without describing Moss Book 1 just a little
Moss
bit.
Book 1 as well, yeah.
So what kind of game is it? Well, I mean, we kind of talk about it as a bit of like a self-co-op action puzzle platformer. Like if you imagine like playing a Zelda game, but you're also an active giant character in it that can move things around and help Link get through the world.
Yeah.
Imagine that you've got this little hero mouse character that stumbles upon you in the forest, a power that represents you, and that unlocks the ability for you to actually enter her world. So we're talking about this cool fairy tale magical adventure that you, through virtual reality's presence, like you're in the headset, you're actually in the world looking around saying, look at these trees, this looks awesome. But then you see this little mouse who's looking right at you and saying, hey, I see you too. And immediately trying to immerse people in this magical fairy tale journey that ends up being a little bit of this like hero's journey. Yeah. Quill needs to go on this big heroic adventure, sorry for the spoilers, to save her uncle who has been trapped in this castle far away in the world of Moss. And she needs you to help her. And you kind of go back and forth. I'm going to move this thing. Now Quill can do something else in the level to solve the puzzle. That's going to enable me to move something else that lets her get to the exit. And that's kind of why we call it a bit of a self-co-op, because you're controlling both characters. Yeah. On the analog stick, you're controlling Quill. With the buttons, you allow her to jump around and attack, but you can also reach in and grab things and move them. And it feels weighty and it feels physical, and you've got that presence in the world. And Moss Book 2, we wanted to continue the story. We actually left off on a little bit of a, hey, but wait, there's more. After you kind of defeat the main boss of the story at the end of Moss Book 1, we reveal that the Arcane, which is kind of the bigger enemy that's represented in the world of Moss, does not end with Sarfog, who was our villain from the first game. Yeah. And you've saved your uncle. He's there. He says, but wait, there's more. And then kind of like we glow this door to signify there's more. And then first thing in the next game is like, well, let's go through that door and let's understand what does he mean by there's more. And this really, for Moss Book 2, the stakes are actually higher than Quill could have ever imagined. She was just in it to save her uncle. Yeah. But now it's kind of, well, now we kind of got to save the whole world. There's more to it than that. And we bring along, treating Moss Book 1 as foundational for the game, because the reception and feedback for the game has blown us away. It's been phenomenal in terms of how people have connected with Quill as a character, connected with the world. We wanted to not ruin that completely, so we said, well, let's keep that and try to improve upon that for the second game. So trying to ensure that there's additional gameplay, new ways to interact with the world, new weapons that Quill can have, and you can charge up with her to solve puzzles and fight combats, and just a whole slew of brand new environments that are just amazing and beautiful to be in, and then a really captivating story that brings you on a pretty emotional journey. I'd say as you're going through the game, and just with the presence of VR and you being in there, a lot of that stuff ends up being even more powerful. It's the opportune moment. He's telling me to stop.
For our listeners for just our audio listeners, we've had Josh's cat just do a big stretch in front of the camera, a big floppy ragdoll.
He said he wanted to be in this, and I guess that was his way. But so that's kind of where we're at with Moss Book 2. It's a continuation. The stakes are higher. There's more gameplay, more features, and just more time to bond with Quill as a character in the world, because that was a big thing that a lot of players told us was something they wanted more of.
Yeah, amazing. I played through Moss Book 1 again before I got into Moss Book 2, and I'm about more than halfway through Moss Book 2. So for my benefit, this will be a spoiler-free podcast as well. But one of the things that I immediately noticed was this increase in fidelity, like the amount that's on screen. I'm playing on the Quest 2, the amount that's on screen, but also in fidelity in regards to the interaction with Quill. Because when you say that, this game has resonated with people, it has. Like it's come to be known as one of the most premier Moss Book 1, I'm saying, and I'm sure Moss Book 2 is going to be there as well. But it's become one of the premier VR experiences, one of those games that you must get if you've got VR, because it is so unique in its level of polish, and it's a very tight experience. And even what you're talking about in regards to this self-co-op, as you've mentioned. But the thing that really clearly resonates with people is this relationship with with Quill. So how early on in the process did that come about? I know that moment you're talking about where you go, I want to do VR. So many people had this moment in the Job Simulator guys got that going, and people heading their space pirate trainer, and people heading different directions. When did that first kernel of an idea come together for this self co-op, this working with Quill, and that partnership that you have there with an on-screen character that we've rarely had before in video games, and probably never in this way?
Well, we knew that, you mentioned that demo of the blue where the whale swims up to you and looks at you in the eye. And it's such a simple premise and simple design, but how powerful that is undeniable. And so, we take the physical interaction that we knew was really novel. And we also knew that we were putting a massive piece of hardware on someone's face and blindfolding them and expecting them to navigate a brand new looking controller device that they've never used before. And so our games needed to be really simple. And I would say that's sort of like, okay, that's what Moss is. I would say, we knew that characters interacting with you was very novel and very unique to VR. What we did not expect was how impactful Quill would be to a lot of people. And we had friends and family come in and play test the E3 demo we created before we introduced Moss and Quill to the world. And they were all like, yeah, this is an amazing experience. You have something very special here. But they all kind of knew what we were making. They had seen Quill or met Quill in some fashion, but we took Moss to E3, and the way there was this raw emotion and connection with this character, and these are all reviewers and media that have been in the industry, like they've played everything, It felt like we were providing something that was unique, but also something that like if you've ever had a pet or something, and like the raw emotions that happen when that being looks at you and is like, I need your help, I need fed, and I need you, I want you to support me and protect me. All those feelings came out with a lot of people there, and there was a handful of people that teared up, and then we brought that back, and we were like, whoa, we knew Quill was cool, but we didn't know like how impactful that could be. And it did change. It changed the story. It changed how our interactions with Quill. We introduced more like sign language, just like different ways for Quill to interact with you.
Yeah.
And I think that was sort of the first game, was like that journey that Josh was explaining.
Yeah.
But the second game was more about, okay, how do we play on that? How can we evolve that relationship? How can we test your relationship in some ways?
And Josh, how did you do that, Josh? Like in the second game, what's that leap? We've got Moss Book 1, where you have this big revelation through game development at E3, and then this reaction from the fans, and after that doubling down once you've taken that news back into the studio. But then you've got Book 2, and as we all know with our first sequel, you've got the chance to like really go back to the drawing board on whatever you want to. And so where did you start with making that relationship and strengthening it between the reader and Quill?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of thought that goes into that. I think one of the first things, though, I should mention, Chris was talking about our E3 demo, how we got all this amazing feedback for it. The result of coming back to the studio after that was like, oh, they really like all of these things.
Yeah.
We need to make sure the rest of the game does that. And we actually had to like pull out a whole ton of stuff that we had done based on these learnings. So
because
we actually kind of,
or to give yourselves more space for development to focus on these things.
It was like one of those moments where you're kind of like face palming. You're like, oh, that's so much better. It's going to be so expensive for us to do this change and shift, but like all of the learning that we had from that demo and the response to it, it told us that was going to be absolutely worth it. So in a way, a lot of that learning and incorporating that came in on Moss Book 1 after we did that demo, which I think was one of the most valuable things as a studio we could have done for this game, just because of the sheer amount of feedback, but then also just confidence that we could have that we were going in the right direction. And that confidence after Moss Book 1 was out really helped firm up us feeling like we could clearly go more in that direction and kind of build upon that. So without trying to spoil too much of the game, that goes into what are new types of interactions that I can have with Quill? What are new ways that through the story, the challenges that you're facing in the game, that you can add layers of complexity to your relationship with her, that you might even be thinking of not room to room, I'm solving a puzzle together, but beyond that, like, what is she thinking right now? How is this going to affect us later? And how is this interact with her relationship with maybe another character that I saw in the game? We want to be asking ourselves these questions. If we can have these characters seem more real, if we can have these relationships that you have with these virtual characters feel like actual relationships, we can increase the overall bond that you're forming with these characters because they feel real. And to you, to somebody playing through, I just went on this crazy thing with Quill, and we're in a room, and she just squeaked and looked at me, and I'm like, what does that mean? It could be a loaded squeak. I'm not entirely sure. But a lot of it, the writing team did such a phenomenal job with the story for Moss Book 2, and they handed us something that was really going to build on this character, even aside from those more custom moments that we'd be putting in. But Moss Book 2, we thought of new essentially we call them kind of like character rules for like, if this is happening, here's what Quill might do in this moment, and trying to keep that feel reactive and try to put a fresh layer on top of those and ensure that those are adding new things. We wanted to ensure that one of our systems that was really successful in the first game and brought some life into Quill was how you'd be having trouble with a puzzle, and then she'd squeak and be like, I'm going to point over here, and then try and pantomime something.
That's the basis of Quill and my relationship. That interaction. That's our most common interaction, definitely.
Is me like, I have to help you solve another one.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, Trent, do you need a hand here? Yes, please, Quill, I do.
Yeah, but there's new puzzle scenarios that you're in, and we want to add a little bit more complexity to those as you're playing through the game. And, it's kind of the whole thing together. Also just providing more opportunities. We it's pure gameplay when you reach in and like charge Quill's weapon so she can do something new, but it's another reason to reach in and have your hand near her. Maybe you're like, cool, I charged your weapon, but now I'm just going to pet you again, just because that's still fun. I like players still really just love doing that as they're playing through the game, because it's a nice way of physically interacting with her throughout the game. And we want to try and improve upon things like that.
I find myself doing things like, when my cat walks past or whatever, I'm chilling there, I'll just like put my hand out and pat him as he walks past. And when I'm running, and I'm the one running Quill past, but every now and then I'll just like catch myself reaching out to like give her a little boop on the head or something like that as she's passing by. It really is amazing how natural the relationship feels after a while. Like you really do settle in with each other. Is that something you noticed early on in playtesting?
Yeah, we made a lot of, I can speak to the visuals. We made a lot of conscious choices to like make you want to feel something emotional with her. And a lot of it was trial and error. We made a version where Quill was very heroic and kind of had more humanoid proportions. And, Tam Armstrong, who's the CEO and one of the founders, he took the headset off and was like, I feel nothing. And so that was a good starting point. We had only up to go from there. And so, we were like, okay, why do you feel that? What can we do to make you feel something, we scrapped that first version, went straight to like, okay, let's make her a real just mouse. Let's make her a mouse. Start from there because, people have mice as pets and, it's something that, you might think, rats are dirty or whatever, but like people generally like mice. There's a lot of mice in culture.
Rats are cool, man. Like we have friends that had rats as pets. They're amazing.
Exactly. And so we started there and instantly we started getting positive reactions. And so,
Well, that's something that I actually want to drill into a little bit because you may or may not know, but I created a video game. Well, not me, but our team created a video game with animals, right? I'm sure you know. I know that you know. But the anthro thing is so interesting, right? Like across so many levels. So fables featuring animals have been around for hundreds, thousands of years in culture, but it seems still like so hard to. There's a big chasm between well-executed anthro media and stuff that kind of just misses the mark or something's a bit off. And one of the things that I feel Polyarc has done so well with Moss Book 1 and Book 2 is the artwork and just even the character design. For example, because, with anthro artwork, you kind of got on one side, you've got full-blown Disney, and then on the other side, you've got sexy wolves with six-packs, right? And I think one of the tendencies that we always speak about is that there is definitely an area of anthropomorphic art that skews very human body, but just with animal head. But it seems like Moss has a full mouse skeleton. Chris, how did you find that space in such a broad range where you could land with, sort of your anthropomorphic art styles? How did you end up landing on your character design for Moss and the rest of the world and dealing with scale and all those questions that come up with, can pigs wear pants? Can a lion ride a horse? Like all these questions that happen when you're the biggest argument I've ever had with Ty Carey, my co-founder and our creative director, was whether a lion can ride a horse. It's literally, we can't talk about that topic still to this day. So how did it all come about? How did you sort of break those eggs and get into that?
Yeah, I mean, really, it has to do with scale and it has to do with physicality and weight. The more we pushed away from something that you could believe is actually there, the more we went more cartoony with the proportions, the less it seemed like it existed in a physical world.
Yes. That's such a great point. The context of looking in as the reader, right? It makes it very different. Answers a lot of questions for you immediately.
Yeah, and the scale of the character really defined what the character should be. That her scale is the size of like a small field mouse.
It took me a while it's a funny thing to say, but actually it took me a while to realize that. I reckon I was in, this is kind of embarrassing. I was in Moss Book 2 before I was like, oh, this world is fully to scale. Like, this is the size of a mouse. That's the size of a bird. Like, that's the size of a big-ass snake, And it just felt so natural. But I think it just it lends so much what's the word, authenticity to that diorama, and that feeling that you are genuinely looking at this mouse and helping it out, that it's a real thing.
Yeah, everything we could do to make you feel like you were there, we did. Anything that pulled you out of the experience, we tried to figure out what that was, and we tried to remove it as quickly as possible. But yeah, as far as like why they ride squirrels,
I'm into it now.
Yeah, like so we have birds, we have toads, and we have squirrels, and I think we don't have the perfect answer for that. I like to think that mice existed in our homes, and so maybe they were closer to human culture, and so they adopted it quicker than like squirrels or birds or and so whatever it takes to sort of like justify.
You have to be like with the hand throw stuff. You've got to be a bit hand wavy at some point. I remember for our Mellow, we did a update. There was like a board skins pack, and so it changed the board with some new art, some skins, and it was seasons was the thing. And so we released an autumn board, and we released a spring board, and the autumn board, like obviously the trees were brown, the leaves were brown, and someone left us a negative review saying that pine trees are evergreen; they're not deciduous, and I remember responding to the negative review being like, but like you're playing a game about talking rats, like, it's really interesting what people latch on to and what they don't, and what it takes. And this is why the scale thing is such a great point that you raise, because even in a fantasy game, there are some things that will help ground it so well, and then other things that you can be kind of hand wavy about. And it's a really interesting path of the creator figuring that out. Josh, I got a question for you in regards to the evolution of design from Moss Book 1 to Moss Book 2. Moss Book 1, it's so tidy and neat a package. It's so restrained. It doesn't try to be anything more than it absolutely needs to be, to sort of be like, hey, because it was really quite early on in the VR cycle. Well, this decade that VR came back around, right? But like very early on in the VR cycle. And it came out and was just like, hey, we're doing this thing and we're doing this very well. We're not doing all the things. So then when you get to Moss Book 2, were there things that fell off the wagon that you were like, oh, that, the classic one, we'll do that in game 2 or whatever, that you had locked and loaded, ready to go? Was how much of it was a response to things that maybe the press, public, your peers felt weren't working? Or if there were any of those things in Moss Book 1, how did you approach that step forward in the evolution of the design?
Yeah. I think all of those are accurate descriptions of things that we did for the second game. We were very careful to take a look at all of the critical feedback that we had on the first game. And I think we were really fortunate, because one of the biggest sources of contention that we had for the first game was just that there wasn't enough of it. I think across the board, which was like that was our goal. We were like, hey, we nailed because we were like short and sweet. This is what we can do as a studio. We're going to make one really polished, high quality game that isn't going to take, people weeks to play through. But I think a lot of people, the strength of that is a lot of people really resonated with the world. They wanted more time in it. And that was something that was continually put in every single review that we saw. It was just like, I just wanted the game to be longer. So that was one thing when we were doing the initial design of the game that we said, okay, we can find ways to do better. And I can talk a little bit about that. The other method of, hey, here's some strengths, things that we thought were working really well. We continued to experiment a little bit after the initial release of Moss Book 1 when we put out our Twilight Garden expansion, which was kind of a little bit of a test bed. We really wanted to put this out. We thought this was really cool additional content for the game, but we were also trying a few new things. That was our first foray into hey, it's kind of non-linear, because you can at any point access this separate part of the game and then progress through this and get your cool rewards, your sword and your armor as you go through. But also that was our first foray into, we're going to give you new stuff and a new interaction. That was our first time doing any kind of charged up weapon in the game. And the response to that was hugely positive in terms of people thinking they were doing cool stuff in puzzles.
Yeah.
They were doing cool stuff in combat,
Mm.
and they just really enjoyed that kind of experience of Quill looks different. She's got a different thing. And I love that I was able to help her get that. And now we're going to go through the game with that cool new stuff. So that was another kind of way of like, hey, we actually kind of tested the waters a little bit as we were putting out that additional content. And that helped feed into how we approach Moss Book 2 as well. And those are kind of two things that at least on the design side that we wanted to see like, hey, what is the new version of that going to look like for Moss Book 2? I think the answer on the weapons side was a little bit more simple with less complexity there, because the answer is, yeah, let's make more of these because people love this stuff. So let's
Gamers
make
want
more
more
of it.
weapons? Wow, yeah.
And then the complexity comes into, okay, we need to stay true to our original intent and design principles of if we are going to add something new to the game, it needs to still satisfy those same things that were satisfying players in the first game. If I get a new weapon, it's got to be just fun at a base level to hit the button and smash things, right? Because whether you're smashing enemies or you're smashing boxes to get dust, you're going to be using that weapon a lot. So at that base level, we want that to feel good. At the level of, hey, this is like a charged weapon, you're going to be reaching in to charge Quill up, or like for Moss Book 2, there's just different ways to charge them. Is there cool texture there? Is there differences between that? And then what is the outcome? Does that outcome feel really good for a puzzle? Does the outcome feel really good for a combat? Does the outcome feel really good for platforming? Which we kind of tried to vary the weapons to be kind of better or at different select avenues of each different area. Like for an example, the sword, when you charge up, that one is very much on the traversal side of things, although it is wicked awesome in combat too, especially if you line up any enemies. The sword specifically, you charge it up, for people who don't know, and Quill just zips in a line. And that allows her to cross really cool gaps for platforming and puzzle solving, but it also allows her to completely obliterate any enemies in between. So we wanted to make sure if we are going to add something, it feels tight, it feels really good to play, and that players are going to appreciate adding that to Quill's essentially tool belt of things to solve puzzles or solve combats. So that was kind of our approach for those. And in terms of the world, that one took longer. You mentioned Moss Book 1 is this tight experience. It's very linear. We're following you go through this chapter. Now you're on this chapter, no going back, just forward, and you're going to go through this set story. And Moss Book 2, we challenged ourselves and said, are there ways where we can have this world feel larger and more connected? And it's not that I'm going through each area once and never going back, but each area is relevant at some point in the story, and I'm going to thread myself around this larger journey, returning to the castle, honestly, multiple times as it acts as a sort of a central hub for your journey. And every time you come back, there's a little something new, because now I have a new ability. Now I have this new thing. I can unlock this new area. So you get a little bit of that, I'm not going to say open world feel, but it definitely does feel more open than the first game. And that was a way of addressing two things. One, we're really just hyped about wanting to allow people to explore the world more. As developers, it's just such an awesome world. And we've created this castle, which sort of functions as an avenue for Quill and you to branch out to different parts of the world of Moss, which is just so cool. And that's our way of doing that. But we also found that was a good way of saying, like, hey, if we build our world in such a way, we can have players be in there and have always meaningful content that doesn't feel like the worst thing that we could do is just be like, sure, you just go through the same stuff and it's just reuse. But it was a way for us specifically targeting, this is a world that has complexities that change as you're going through it. And that's going to be meaningful for players. And in addition, it allows us to have a little bit more length on the story while still being a really small team that's putting this game together. Because we're still like a little bit larger than the first book. The team
what are
at
you,
Polyarc,
35 or 40 or something now? Or?
The studio now, like whole studio, I think we're at 35. Chris, is that accurate?
35, maybe 36
amazing.
now.
And Moss Book 2, Moss Book, for context for everybody, Moss Book 1, we were 15 people at the studio shipping that game.
It's a
And
fun
we're,
size as well, 15.
yeah, oh,
It was good.
super.
Yeah.
And for Moss Book 2, it's like we're at like 20. So like some growth, but we're still like the small scrappy team. So we're trying to understand when people say, I want more of the game, how can we deliver that in a good way? How can we increase the length of this game given what we can do? It also, one other thing that did help is we had, additional animation support in the game too. Because if you're going to make the game longer, this big story driven adventure, we're going to want to give the player more like cool moments and cinematic scenes going through. So that also allowed us, working with the story team, to kind of bring those two goals together of how do we make it compelling and feel really grip the player their whole way through. And it's not just like I'm going through levels, because that's totally not what we want to do by trying to add this kind of content to the game.
So I'm really interested to come back to the story. So I put a little note and come back to the story because I'm very interested to hear about the process and what it means having the reader involved, and Quinn being like nonverbal in a lot of the scenes and everything like that. But Chris, something that I noticed immediately with Moss 2 is what Josh is talking about, is that I'm spending more time traversing back through environments. The design of the world is different in regards to this sort of like hub and spoke design with the castle in the center, and also those Metroidvania elements. I'm seeing things. I think one of the first rooms where I was like, why can't I do this thing? I was like, oh, okay, I got to. In this game, I'm coming back here again. So, and I really felt for the team at Polyarc, because playing the first back ages ago when I first was playing Moss Book 1, I was like, I'm spending so little time in these beautiful environments. I'm moving straight through them. So what did that mean for you and your art crew on Moss Book 2 in regards to, did it just mean like, oh, okay, people see more of our awesome stuff, or how did it change the way that you approach the worlds in, or the rooms or whatever you may call them in Moss Book 2, and how you piece the whole thing together? It's just absolutely stunning. I think moving around the greenhouse, I would just like spend half the time looking around and made a note to stop in every single diorama and have a look around the room.
Yeah, the approach in a lot of ways was similar, because I'd say the overall design of the game, you do pass through some of the same areas, but you do branch off and you have these little, like, I would say almost like mini adventures. And so the conservatory that you're talking about is its own little adventure and journey, and you are able to traverse back through it. But each of these spaces really serves like some very strong purposes. Like Quill is there for a very specific reason. I'd say one of the big challenges was, how do we get you out of the castle? Coming up with, where do you actually go? Like, what are fun, exciting locales that we want you to go through? Because
when you're already in a castle, right? As well. Like what's the carrot when you're inside a castle already?
Right. The adventure, Moss Book 1 and 2 were meant to be one story. Like, getting to the castle was like going to be a big part of the adventure, and then when you're there, you have this sort of like this end game, and that's where you meet the owl, and the owl is always going to be the main antagonist. We found ourselves in a position where we only could make one half of the game with our team size that Josh was talking about early on. But now that you're in the castle, how do we get you out? Because on the first one, although it was really linear, it made sense to the story, but you were still passing through all these different types of, you go to this beach in the morning, and you also go through the swampy area, and you get to go through a lot of different locations. And then in Moss 2, we're like, okay, we can't just have you in these like, they were larger than life cathedral style interiors, but we really wanted you to go elsewhere. And so we're like, okay, how creative can we get with that? You go under the castle, you find some dungeon, fiery lava pits down there. And then, we again, like you were saying, you go to these gardens and we make them really lush. So we have a little bit of that like classic Moss look, that you're still still get the green and the warm lighting. And then,
the woodland environments.
Yeah, and it still wasn't enough. And so we came up with the idea of, okay, we have portals.
Never enough.
Yeah. We're like, we need even more. And so you end up like going through these doorways that act as portals to these different realms, and you get to go to these like snowy mountaintops of Tibet. And I'd say the room to room, our the way we constructed them was very similar. I think we did develop, Josh, you can tell me if we're wrong, an agreement to like, okay, how do we keep players in these rooms a little bit longer? And so while building the rooms was very similar, we did try creative ways of like, okay, how can we let a player experience these places for a little bit longer, and even slow them down sometimes to like, okay, this is a moment where they can take in the world. And so, I think you totally caught on to something as a content creator. You're like, yeah, okay.
How expensive was this sequence?
That's it. Yeah, the producer side of my brain is like, let's get people to spend more time in this, perhaps. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in VR, because you can look behind everything, and we want it to be believable. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into these spaces, and
well, that drives actually another question that I had for you, which is an interesting one, because it's not just in VR, right? You almost have your own sort of like little space that you've carved out too, which is this notion of this diorama with this mouse and the self co-op thing. What do you find yourself as sort of like the top line principles that maybe people listening, game artists listening to this podcast, may find interesting, that sort of that where VR and your approach to VR, what you're doing with Moss Book 1 and 2 changes for, as opposed to your time, say, at Bungie or something like that? What do you find yourself saying to the new game artists that join the team? You're like, oh, no. Remember, this is like VR, you got to blah, blah, blah. Or this is in Moss, you got to, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have those moments? Are there things that are like quite different in your approach, or that you got to remind yourself of, or is it just like make the game art, but just like here and that scale with the mouse?
I think one of the critiques that we got from the first game that Josh pointed out was they just wanted more. It needed to be longer and bigger, and they just wanted more moss. And we're finding out we are a studio that definitely favors quality over quantity, and I think there's always this struggle for us to be like, okay, we want to make a big chunk of game, but we know we love working in small teams, and we know that like our quality bar internally, like we're very hard on ourselves, and we want to make the best experience possible. And I would say that's one thing we're constantly having to negotiate with each other. Is like, okay, maybe we don't need to polish as far. But I think, maybe I'll speak for Josh. I think one thing that I think has changed for all of us is like building affordance into objects that we want you to grab. We give you this world, and we want you to interact with all these things, but sometimes the player doesn't want to do that, and we're kind of forcing their hand to like find something to interact with. And I would say we all become industrial designers in a way. We're designing, and then on the visual side, it's no longer us behind a screen navigating a character. You are in the world now. And so
that's actually a really great segue into a question that I have here, which is this notion of when do you ask the player to reach in and touch the world, and when do you allow them to sit back and just fiddle around with their thumbstick and play it like a platformer, where their only real responsibility is to be the game camera, which we all know is so incredibly important in platformers, right? Puzzle platformers. So Josh, how did you find that line between agency and player agency, and then even moments where Quill is like, hey, she stops doing everything and then she chimes in, or she does a particular thing, or where I'm even interested in things like, I remember I've had situations where I've like got 4 buttons pressed and I'm like holding an enemy over here and shooting it at another one and running around with Quill and trying to remind myself not to move the thumbstick when I'm trying to drag an enemy and pushing Quill off a cliff. So that balance between player agency in regards to your experience in your diorama and a standard puzzle platformer, like what's your goals there, and how did you find that balance?
Yeah, I think, thinking about that, how we approached it was there's kind of 2 levels of pacing that we had when we looked at the game, because you've got your standard action adventure platformer pacing, which is, hey, we just want to make sure that the platforming feels paced out with the combat, feels paced out with the puzzle solving. I think we've all played games that do that, but we had to also, on top of that, so had to do that, but also from a standpoint of what am I doing in VR? How attentive do I have to be at all times?
Yeah.
How often do I need to grab things? How often am I just kind of running through a room? How often is a room just largely, we created this so you can look around and like have just a great experience like taking this whole room in, and then you walk in the next room is something. So we would draw out big giant pacing maps throughout the game just to make sure like, hey, are we hitting things? I mean, we do this on the design side. We do similar pacing for like, art experience, story experience, all of that, just evaluating what is the player taking in. Are they getting too much of one thing? Are they not getting enough of another thing? Because that's what kind of creates this experience that feels well balanced to them. And then also in VR, if we're constantly pushing the player too far in one direction, they're not going to feel comfortable. We, like, one example I can think of is on the puzzle solving side. If you force a player to solve really hard puzzles with a VR headset, a heavy VR headset on for too long a period of time, their head's going to get sweaty because they're thinking really, really hard. And especially if it gets really tough, like they're also then kind of frustrated. And then also on top of that lack of comfort, they're like, you know what, I don't want to play this right now. So we have to be very careful about the complexity that we're putting into the game and how often that complexity does show up. We have, every tough puzzle in the game we kind of call like an apex puzzle, which is like, it's putting all of the pieces that we tried to teach you throughout this area into one puzzle that kind of tests you and make sure that you can go through to the next area. And we had to be really careful with those and sometimes just scale them back completely because players would have trouble with it. Or one of my preferred ways of dealing with this rather than scaling back the puzzle is just like amp up how much Quill's helping. So that we can just feed in from a different angle, like, hey, we made you move a lot, but now the character here's a time for her to be a little bit autonomous and help you out. The pacing
so what are some examples of that, just to hone in on that for a little bit? Like when you say, oh, okay, instead of dialing this back, let's have Quill help out a little bit. What's in your toolbox there in regards to like what can you actually effectively and practically do, you found, without the player feeling like Quill is encroaching on their agency?
Yeah, so we have a few tools when we're trying to solve these puzzles. Sometimes it's just simply spotting an enemy will draw your attention to something that becomes important. And while we're doing that, we can combine that with something that's adequately timed. We call it like our kind of our spirit lantern or our tutorial glow, where something just softly glows in the background and pulls you in. That's kind of our soft, like, hey, here's something that you should really be like starting to pay a little bit of attention to. And we're very careful to be extremely consistent about that visual language. So if you do see that, that is something to grab or something that you should then reach in and experiment with. Beyond, above that is kind of where we're like, okay, now Quill is going to be pointing at something for you. And sometimes it's interchangeable depending on the puzzle or depending on the designer who's working on it. Because there's a little bit of even that designer agency as you're putting it together. But Quill pointing at things would be like kind of like our next level of like, okay, she's going to give you a hint. The Apex version of that is we're going to have to make something custom because we just made something way too complicated. And hopefully we don't have to do that. We actually had a completely custom Quill hint performance in our E3 demo for a Moss Book 1, where it was like, this is very complicated. I'm going to do this. And then you move this guy over here and do that. And we're trying our best not to do those just because the cost of doing that. But
it was adorable, though.
It was so cute. And it was amazing. And the final kind of thing that we only do just for like tutorials really would be like, okay, we're going to render a controller and really help you out. We only do that kind of at the beginning of the game to ease the player in. If we have to do more than those other things aside from the Nux, then we feel like, it's okay to let the player try to figure it out a little bit, because we also don't want to go too far where everything feels really handholdy. The nice thing about Quill is it's kind of hard to go a little bit too far with that, because there's this character communicating with you. And that's why it's one of our go-tos for helping players if they're having trouble, because it's a real living character and they want to help you. And it is so much more effective and so much more easier to accept for players that they're not having their hand held through the game, but this character is just trying to communicate. And they might not.
That's a great point. It's not the developer being like, "Come on, bro."
Exactly. And And they might not even get what she's saying, but it encourages them to try something in that area. It's like, oh, she went over there, she pointed, and like, I don't know, is she wrong? Is she giving me the right hint? You start having a conversation with her.
Yeah.
And it just feels like the right thing to do. And that's just one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we're pacing out the game. Where do we have these moments, and how do we vary it up enough so something can always feel fresh in the game, and nothing's ever sitting around too long.
And let's it's fascinating. It's fascinating, this stuff. Let's dive into the design of a room. Run us through how just one room gets designed from sort of like start to running. What's the process?
Oh gosh. Okay.
You can give me the high level if you want. It's always fascinating to hear how different teams and different design, like you say, different designers have different design agency, just like different studios have different ways in which they approach these things. And it's one of the beautiful things about Moss, both book 1 and book 2, is how much it is really a sum of its parts. You can see it doesn't feel, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's different internally, but it doesn't feel like art. The art team is wrestling with the design team, or that, story feels very well integrated as well. I'm really interested to hear how that process goes, comes about.
Yeah. It's one of those things that in terms of how you go about in the process, it's always debated. Will you try and figure out like what is the shape of the room going to be before you know what the mechanics are going to be? Because we're in game development, you know nothing that is going to be in the game before you have to start making meaningful progress on this game.
So it's so good to hear that from another studio. That's fair. Thank you so much. I needed that.
I'm glad to contribute. So you've got to. And then on top of that, you've kind of got story objectives. Like what is the purpose of this room? What is meant to happen here? And if you say like that's kind of story, design, and art are trying to like approach it from different avenues, that largely ends up being how most of our stuff kind of goes. Every time you start from one standpoint, you need the others to lift you up. And so that's kind of my way of saying there's kind of 3 ways that we would approach every room as we're trying to figure out why does this room need to be here? What does Quill need to do in this room? Yeah. What are interesting like virtual reality features or mechanics that could take place in here that we're excited about, that we either know that we already have prototyped in various scenarios, so we can feel confident that feature is going to stay in for the final ship project, or we have this really cool idea, we're going to try it out and see how it works in this room, and hopefully all of that works. Which, I mean, that has happened really, like we've had good success with all of that. So we try to keep an open mind to new creative ideas that are coming in, as well as trying to approach it from the different avenues, but trying to just distill it and keep it really simple. In a lot of ways, it's kind of, we say, okay, we have a general area that we want for the game. And we know that we want this area to kind of encompass some pacing of mechanical features that we have throughout. And along that pacing track of, you can kind of follow like the Nintendo, like learn, test, twist kind of model. We'll want to try and ensure that we have some path along that to the end encounter or climax encounter of whatever this area we're creating is. And this room is the 3rd room on that. So we try to make a plan around that, bring into what mechanics or features will go into the room. And we plot that down, and we follow kind of a lot of our core principles of we're creating a diorama. So we know that this space needs to be, we actually have really cool metrics we'll place in Unreal. We place the camera down and we press like a checkbox on it, and it just draws all of the bounds that are really comfortable for a player's diorama experience that we really like for Moss. And that kind of is our little cheat sheet on the design side and the art side for like, okay, something in here, we want it to be this high, this wide, this is going to be comfortable. This is what's going to feel good on, a PlayStation DS4 front camera track controller before you get offsides and it loses tracking. This is what's going to feel good outside of that for anything else that is like either other cameras or other inside out tracking that's going to help. So we really first want to decide, like, what is the size of this space? What are the bounds of it even before I start putting in different platforms and features in the game. And then the very first thing that we do after that, that we found is incredibly important, is the interactions that you're going to have in that space. You at that point need to place those in, because those are so critical and so important to how everything is going to flow through the
Yeah.
space. We have these design principles for our interactions that they are big. They feel really weighty. Quill is going to move on, through, under, over them in some way. So those need to have big significance in terms of the pathing that you're going to be creating through the level. So if you've got some big drum that you're going to spin, you slap that right in the middle before you place anything and build that level around it. And that's part of what can make those dioramas feel even more crafted, because we essentially did have to craft it around these mechanics, these physical interactions that we feel really strongly need to fit the environment, so they're believable, but also so the environment makes sense as you're going through it.
And so that, in regards to the environment making sense and having a place in the world, Chris, where does the art team come in at this point? You know, obviously all throughout, but what did the process look like for you? Sort of what were the steps? What phases do you go through for a room, and you know what are the art team's principles, you know, to make sure that design's vision for a room sort of, you know, meets your own as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, very high level. We do meet with the story team and make sure that we as an art team have our own goals as far as you know, the different types of locations we want to go to, and that's sort of kind of off to the side, so we remember that. And then I'd say the process of making all of the rooms in the game is highly collaborative. While some of the more complicated rooms that require a lot of playtesting will take a lot longer to even get to the stage where art is ready to even touch it, because a lot of the puzzles that I would say, you know, Josh's team, you guys probably spend the most time on those types of rooms.
Hurting our brains.
Yeah, they go through so much, and it just wouldn't make sense for us to hit those. And so those are usually at the very end. But while that's happening, we can start laying out the start and end of every single, like I would say, those offshoot adventures, or even in the beginning of the game. Like, you know, we want to establish the environment. We want to make sure that, you know, players take their time, and we're trusted to create a lot of those story environments while a lot of that is happening. So while a lot of the design work and figuring out of those, you know, core mechanics are happening, we're still building parts of the game. And I would say that sort of the outer rooms of the game, and sort of figuring out what are our palettes, what kind of, you know, major props do we need to develop. We start testing lighting, we start testing color palettes, making sure that every zone has a very distinct emotional journey. We collaborate with the story team. At which stage is Quill on this part of the event? Is she down in the dumps, or is she in adventure mode? And that will directly affect the how we create the assets and what kind of, you know, lighting and assets we want in those spaces. And that helps with pipelining production too. If we're continued to keep moving and making art, and design is able to continue designing, and then eventually we start crossing each other's paths more, and we have, two other types of rooms. If we have the puzzle room, and if we have the what do we call them, that are strictly more like mood setting story, Vista rooms. Yep. And then we have some rooms that are just for traversal, where we shake it up a little bit for Quill, you know, like make sure it's not just a straight line from left to right. Make sure that helps slow down the journey a little bit, to make sure that, you know, players, you know, as far as pacing, narration, players can look around a little bit more. And then we also have like combat spaces. And usually those middle rooms are the ones where I feel like it can start with art or start with design, but we're working very closely with each other. And some of those rooms are the more fun ones, because we're not alone a lot of the time. It's like, okay, let's work together and learn from each other.
Those are the best ones, I think.
Yeah.
It's like that back and forth iteration that we get, just excited about an idea, and then, you know, as being like, okay, I put this thing in here, we have a device here, and we've got this pressure plate here, what do you think? And then like do something really cool, and it looks beautiful and amazing, even though it's just like block art, and you're like, oh, I know. And then you get these like ahas back and forth even as you're making it, and you just build off the talent of each other. I think it just makes great content.
It does.
Well, speaking about talent and the talent of others, it's clear that there's a whole ton of talent at your studio on the narrative and story side of things. So, Josh, help myself and our listeners understand what's that process for the story team. What's the structure of your story team? Who's responsible for this, and how's it come about and find its way into the game?
This will boggle some people's minds a little bit. Our structure. So we have at the current time, our HR director is also our lead writer.
That's too much power. That's way too much power for one person.
She is fantastic and absolutely amazing in everything that she does. Our CEO, Tam, was also a key part of our writing team, and then we outsourced for some additional writing support on the team. So in terms of how did they do it, just starting with that shout out to who is making up our story team. A lot of it was just starting with drafts of what the story is. They took a very jump in if you know more about this specifically too, Chris. They took an approach of like, it's like we're doing like a screenplay, like a movie. We often talk about Moss being kind of like a stage play. You're going between these dioramas, and it's like the lights go out, people shuffle in, change everything, and the lights come back on. It's a different scene.
That's like such a great analogy. Yeah, I feel it. Yeah, it's real.
They really wanted to take that approach, and to that point, they're even doing like professional screenwriting software that they're doing for like putting it all together, making sure everything matches how it would. And it was a lot of kind of testing some waters of like, hey, we've got some ideas, because it's a very creative process. So at Polyarc, at least, even on the writing side, it's like, let's get people together, let's pitch some ideas of what might happen or what might be feasible to happen in the game, and see how people are reacting and see how people can build off that or even support that. I remember being in various kind of brainstorming meetings, what that was led by the writing team, and they had ideas of what if the game ended this way, what if it ended that way, and just trying to once again be really collaborative and know that in the game making process, everybody on the team is trying to get a little something different out of it and wants to contribute in any way that their skills currently can to try and help make other people's efforts better. So we would have a lot of those early on, and that helped lead them to different drafts of scripts. We went through multiple ones, and then they're like, here's our other draft. Let's send it out to the team, see how everybody feels about that. People would read it, go through it, offer critique, offer notes. And that was like the whole studio would get it and go pretty wide. So a lot of it was just kind of building up. What is the script going to be? And once we had an idea of the script, I mean, we had already been building up a lot of the rough ideas of the game and how it would work with that script. So kind of like, it's like a chicken and egg thing, but we're doing both at the same time, trying to figure out the right way to proceed. And they did an amazing job. And a lot of the times too, it's balancing, because like they're trying to balance the in-game story, but also knowing that we're going to be going to the library and that they're writing something that's more akin to like a traditional story, like flipping through pages and what is going to unravel next. So it kind of adds that additional challenge, knowing that the player is going to have to switch up and like change that context. Of course it's going to flow really well, but it's like almost a different medium of storytelling within our game that they adapt to. And I think they did a fantastic job. And I think it speaks a lot to that very collaborative process and trying to ensure that everybody can have a little bit of a share in the direction that the story went.
Well, it's very clear from Moss Book 1. Like I said, I played Moss Book 1 a while ago, but I did play through it again before jumping into Moss Book 2. Like literally finished it, closed it, and then booted up Moss Book 2. And that leap forward in design, in the fidelity of the world and the art that we've spoken about, it's also there in the narrative design and the effectiveness of your storytelling and the maturity of it as well. It's really quite something to see across all the elements, whether it's the book and the way that they're told, or the way that the story is structured and delivered in Moss Book 2. It's quite an achievement for sure. It's really impressive. So for the last part of, you're welcome. You're most welcome. for the latter part of the podcast, I'd love to speak a little bit more about the production / business side of the studio and the business of making a VR game. Congratulations on your recent rounds and everything that you've raised.
Mhm.
It's super exciting.
Thank you.
We've spoken a lot about the games, but the studio has just been one that seems to have had this steady success with big spikes or steps up along the way. Watching from the outside, I know it probably feels very different from the inside. It always feels like you're in the eye of a storm when you're running a game studio. But let's talk first about VR. You've very much positioned yourself from very early on as this premier VR studio. Some would say before VR was even really like a proven commercial thing. Oh, you've obviously made a really good go of it. How does it feel now being in the industry, the VR one specifically? I'm talking about like that segment of the industry, and seeing the success of the Quest 2 and so many more people coming to it. So, Chris, how does it feel looking out for the future? Obviously very positive. I mean, you're continuing, but give us a bit of your take about being a VR studio at this current point in time and what that means as commercially and as a business.
Oh, it's incredible to because we were believers. We have been believers from the very beginning, and early on we made a lot of choices that were like, okay, we need to be here. We can't go all in. We can't do everything right now. Let's build a really talented team that believes in this journey, and take our time, really, because we knew that the market was going to take its time. And I mean, we're starting to feel really confident with some of the numbers we're seeing of VR headsets, and a lot of them, I don't know how official a lot of them are, but to hear, some of the rumors about how well the Quest 2 is selling, just really makes us feel pretty good about this game.
About selling some VR games, yeah.
And I love just thinking about like where we are now, and where the technology is, and where the excitement of everybody around the space is, and it's only going to get better. Like all the hardware is getting sleeker, and it's weighing less. It's tracking inside out. I remember that the idea of inside out tracking was just this, like, we knew that companies were messing with it, but we were like, oh, we cannot wait for that to happen. And it came a lot quicker than I think we were expecting. Just to think back, like, oh wow, that used to be a dream of ours, was that, and now it's here, and almost all the headsets are getting it. And man, to think about what we've been here for 7 years, VR headsets have been on, really on the market for about 5, and to think about what happens in 3 more years or 5 more years is just very exciting. And I know you were like, let's talk about VR, but I mean, it keeps going, right? A lot of this technology can go into other forms, and we are excited for AR. We're really excited for anything that really means truly interactive entertainment, where you can interact with the character and you can go on adventures. And so I do think it's in our DNA that we are going to be a character studio. We solidified ourselves as a top VR company, but I think we've also established ourselves as a top character studio as well. And that's
funny.
We're not going to stop.
As you were talking, I sort of realized, I was like, oh, I've made a massive presumption that you have decided that you're a VR studio, right? You just made a couple of VR games. Is that something like, it's really interesting to hear this, because you clearly are a character studio, and I think that's a much better way to phrase it. Do you feel that like VR is tied to the DNA and then the future of the studio, or is it more so the medium that speaks to the messages that you're trying to get out there, whether it's these character driven messages and stories?
I think we're addicted. We're addicted to the future. We're addicted to, like, we want all the new headsets. We want all the new technology.
Yeah.
We want to play with it, because I think we have this taste of like being pioneers in a very important shift in our industry. And I think we love that part of it. I think VR, we're still doing it because, we have fun doing it. Our game is meant to be in VR. At least the Moss games are meant to be in VR. And, I think a lot of our opportunities, we get approached by other companies and like, hey, can you make this demo for us? Can you make this game for us? Because of Moss. And so those opportunities haven't run dry. But now we're looking to different, and you know what? You never know. Like maybe someone at the studio might have an idea for a flat screen game that we're like, oh wow, that's really exciting for us. We could make a game outside of VR at some point. But right now, that's kind of where all of our opportunities are coming.
I love that term, the flat screen game. That's so good. Flat screen game. I feel almost insulted that we're making flat. It's like a derogative term that you use for other game developers.
Yeah, every time I say that, I'm like, okay, there's got to be a better way to phrase that.
No, I love it. Josh, interestingly, like in a similar line of questioning, and like Vindication's a hell of a drug, and you were early believers in VR, and that bet's obviously paid off both, critically, commercially, and culturally. You've literally come in and shifted the medium. It's clearly better for Moss Book 1 and Book 2 being here. And so for yourself, design director, there is another thing like approaching very rapidly on the horizon. And some would say that almost every 9 or 10-year-old is already in it. And that's the metaverse, right? And there's big conversations going on about the metaverse. But it's interesting talking about yourselves or, thinking about Polyarc, at least as an outsider, so to speak, to the studio, because your studio has built your reputation, and you've spoken so much today about your importance of small, boutique experiences, really, that quality over quantity. So even just, not speaking on behalf of the studio, but just yourself as a design director, and the metaverse comes along, right? Like, is it interesting? It's a pretty divisive thing for some folks, not even in an angry sense, but just not for it or believe in it completely. What does it mean for you when these headsets are plugging people into the metaverse, but they seem like such much more expansive experiences than what Polyarc has sort of, aligned itself with and what you focused on for so long?
Yeah, I think, thinking about the metaverse, I don't know if we're at a point yet where we even know exactly how that is going to unfold, and what is it going to be, because we're still kind of discovering that.
Yeah.
We don't really know, is it going to be Meta who, gets the big metaverse thing? Is it going to be a combination of a bunch of different platforms, a bunch of different studios that form whatever the metaverse is? Is it something we haven't thought of yet, and this is just the first generation of what that's going to be? I think in general, the concept, that the idea of all that connectivity and being able to be immersed in this giant virtual world that connects everybody around the world is extremely compelling. It's an exciting idea, and I guess I'm not speaking for Polyarc, because this is kind of like, I don't know. It's still an early concept for even us, but the idea that Polyarc could be a part of it. I don't think, you think the idea of the metaverse is this grand big thing, but even in the metaverse, you just imagine little islands of cool things that people can plug into and want to be a part of. And I think that's a kind of an easy in for a lot of studios that might be like us, where we're like, we'd love to be a part of it. And if it's an avenue for people to interact with or take in content from sources they haven't before, or sources that they just really love and they want to experience more of, that's kind of an avenue for us to provide content through that. We don't really know yet how it's all going to form, because it is kind of, we're figuring it out as we go. And that's kind of, how we were early adopters to virtual reality. There's a lot of people that are kind of early into the metaverse going all in. I don't think we're necessarily there yet as a studio, but one thing that I've learned very well from Tam, our CEO, is like, there's no like cutting it off, like, no, we're not going to do it. There's always like an open conversation, like, hey, we can understand this concept more and see if it can be valuable for Polyarc, but also maybe if we can bring value to people that might be experiencing the metaverse and saying, I really like stuff that Polyarc makes. I would love for them to be a part of this, and then us understanding how we do that. It's kind of early for what that would look like, of course, but it's really cool to theorize and imagine what that could be, because the metaverse is almost like a dream right now. Like this big imagination of what it could be.
Yeah.
And there's lots of places that are putting it together, and they're doing like a fantastic job of trying to better understand how this concept could come together. And I think that's going to continue to evolve and get better as they better understand it and understand how humans want to connect and communicate and collaborate even over the metaverse, because it's not just games, of course.
It's such an interesting point as well that you mentioned about what Tam was saying in regards to, having those conversations, keeping yourself open to all the different possibilities. It's so important in our industry and medium when things can, you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden Microsoft has bought Activision for $70 billion, or they're, the Wii is like, changes the industry, and no one had really seen it coming. Or you go to Valve one day and they've got, their Cronenberg VR set up, and you have a vision of building a studio around that. It really is important. Speaking about building a studio, you're also scaling, at the moment, or you've scaled at least, a certain degree, and it's never easy. Scaling it comes with its own challenges and growing pains. It's almost a skill in and of itself, right? What have you seen? Even if it's not, it sounds like your studio is definitely a lot all hands on deck in many different ways, and I know at that size it's like people wearing a lot of different hats. But how are you going about scaling the studio, and what have been sort of some of your guiding lights or your big wins or particular challenges? Because going from a team of 15 to 35, even though it doesn't seem like much, we all know that culturally that can be a big shift, or organizationally that can be a big shift as well. Chris?
Yeah. Well, that's we have found, like, we have our own ambitions, and we would like to scale the team sometimes quicker than we're able to. We're finding that we have a limit to that, and we've had to sort of scale back our ambitions there a little bit, because finding really good people takes time, and we don't want to rush it. And we find that, the reason why I'll speak for the reason I like coming here is because I love everybody I work with. And I think if you try to speed that process up and hire too many people too quick, that might not be the case. You might just find that you're working with a bunch of strangers, And so we do take our time. And when people, when developers come on board at Polyarc, we try to take the time, and now a lot of it's virtual, but we do like virtual lunches and hang out with them. But
are you working fully virtually at the moment, the team, or do you have a space?
A lot of the team is. We're about 35. I would say 5 to 10 people still go into the studio, but not even full time. Yeah. I'm usually 3 days at home, 2 days at the office. I need the a little bit of that. For people.
The cabin fever strikes some of us for sure. I'm definitely one prone to it.
And like, it's in some of our employees' stories are just, their lives are just improved by it. So I'd say even COVID for some has been a blessing. They're like, oh wow, like, we've been forced in a way to learn how to work, and we developed half of Moss 2 virtually, maybe even more of it.
More than half.
And we did it, and we somewhat successfully. And you hear of others, tech companies being like, all right, time to come back to work. And they're flirting with the idea of forcing everyone back, and they get this pushback. And then, it takes a little bit, and they're like, oh, you know what? We'll wait 6 more months and see how everything shakes up. But we've heard everyone. And I don't think there's a future for Polyarc where we force anybody to come back. It's working. And there are things that are more difficult, but at the same time, it's way of life has been improved for some. I mean, if you even think the very first thing that comes to mind is like commuting. Like no one has to like get in their car in the morning and like, tiresomely like drive to the office, sometimes in kind of bad traffic.
It's interesting. We polled our studio. We have done through the pandemic. We've been working from home since end of March 2020. And when we polled the team in regards to like, what are your concerns about coming back into the studio? We had like 15 different reasons, and we drew it in. So like commuting, we had like 4 different things, like length of commute, difficulty of commute, or blah, blah, blah. All of them, all 4 were like just at the top. It was, and by a long margin. It's very, very interesting how much like people appreciate having that, whether it be the time or the difficulty getting in or whatever it might be. And some people have even expressed to us, like, and it makes sense. Like, this is the stuff that's important. If I have to go into work, it's 45 minutes there and back. That's an hour and a half I don't get to spend with my kid who's 5 years old. And it's a really important, time to be with them in their life. And how can you argue with that? Well, you're like, well, excuse you, we have a computer cartoon to make.
Yeah. I mean, you get it. You totally get it.
Yeah.
If we found that just Moss 2 took an extra year to develop, like if we had data that suggested.
I think it's different at different points in development as well, right?
Yeah. And we're still learning. We're deciding to, like, we have Discord running all the time. I think there's going to be, like, just even for the art team, more effort to just be there for each other. Cause we did just hire, we just hired 3 new artists, and each of them are starting within a month of each other. And, I just think being available to them is just really important. And so I think, and that's a brand new thing we just are starting. And it seems so simple and, like, obvious now, but we're still learning how to adapt. And, all these things, back to recruiting, it all just takes time and care and just doing our best and wanting to make really good games. Like, how do we best serve that? And I think happy employees is probably the top thing. It's like, we want to make sure that
it's a good one.
It is a good one. I mean, we spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for most studios with these people. It's really important to surround yourself with people. I strongly believe you're the sum total of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And when I think that 2 of those 5 are my business partners, a bunch of the time I'm like, thank God I chose wisely there.
Yeah, exactly. And we're trying to make. I love our industry because we're making fun. Like, we're trying to make fun. Yeah. And so it is so important that we're having fun doing it. Because I do think every game I've worked on, if the team is having fun, it's going to be a good experience. If they're not, then it's not going to be. And I think that is a really simple way of, sort of organizing our priorities. So.
Yeah. And so, Josh, what does the scaling mean for you, sort of in a more practical sense? Thinking about the next games that you may have on the stove at the moment, and your capabilities as a studio in regards to creating content or expanding your experiences. What's been sort of one of the major motivating things for you with the scaling of the studio and the success that Polyarc's been having in this regard?
Yeah, well, in the scaling, the change from Moss book 1 to 2 has been, we've got some more resources, we have more people that can help us create these experiences that we thought of. And when we talk about the studio growing, we're at 35, but only a portion of that is on the Moss team. We have more than one project, so now it's becoming getting an understanding of, like, okay, we have personnel that are going to be split between multiple projects at the studio, and we're at that point going to be learning similar things across different projects, and how can we share that information back and forth and ensure that we're not needing to completely do all of these brand new things, which, like, all of VR for the last bit is just like, I don't know how to do this. We have to figure out how to do this. Just like over and over and over again, beat into our heads that we just need to relearn so much when we're developing a lot of these games. A lot of those learnings can really be shared between the teams. So trying to ensure that you have that open communication between designers that are working on Moss and designers that are working on another thing, to make sure that as we're running into those challenges, we can try and optimize that a little bit. In terms of how that affects me thinking about a Moss project, I know that the company is going to be larger, but we also, it's a balancing act, knowing that while the studio is getting larger, does that going to wind up being additional projects, or is that going to be that we just want to keep pushing scale and getting bigger? It's one of those things that we want to be really mindful of, because you want to ensure that you still feel like the company is, as Chris said, you know everybody, you understand the people that are on your team. You don't want to get it too big, and it's trying to balance that out. And so far, with our teams not getting too huge above, the first Moss game, we're trying to take it slow. We're trying to ensure that scale makes sense, but also knowing that it gives us advantages when we're talking about the quality of the game or like the length of the experiences of the game. So trying to be very careful and very specific about how we're going to use those talented people to help us make the game is kind of the approach, which is basically ends up just being like we got to do a bunch of planning with a project manager. That's how you sum that down. But
Yeah.
making sure it makes sense, because we don't want to. The danger of it is saying, oh, we've got more people, we're going to scale up, let's make something super big. We have to be very careful about our design intention, but also what we're doing from an artistic, writing, like every discipline, like what is going to be feasible to make sure that it's sustainable for us as a studio, because it's not just about bringing new people into the studio. It's about ensuring that everybody at the studio has a really good quality of life, and we're ensuring that we're not pushing things too far for the goal of just making more and bigger games. We really care about everybody that's at the studio. So it's this balancing act to try and find out what that right compromise is.
Well, it's very clear. I think I can speak very confidently saying that I think the press, the public, your peers, all can see and understand how much Polyarc is, of a very focused studio in its objectives, and very, I would say, almost purposeful. Like your games are they're focused, and then also they're executed really well. You can be focused but not deliver on that thing. And it seems very much like, just talking to you now, that's extended to the studio as well. It's so incredible what you've achieved with both Moss Book 1 and 2, but critically, culturally, commercially, and then to see the success of the studio continuing, it's really, really, really been exciting to watch. I think we'll wrap it up there. I want to thank you guys so much for the chat today. But let's give it a plug. And now correct me, Josh, I'm going to throw it to you. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, right? But Moss 2 is already out on PSVR, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. And Quest 2 is coming on
July 21st.
July 21st.
3 days from when we're currently recording this.
All
but
right,
by the time people are hearing this, it'll probably be out.
Exactly. Well, listeners, you just heard it. Moss 2 is going to be out on Quest 2 and PSVR, or Moss Book 2, I should say. Got to stay in canon. And I know tonight I'm going to go and hang out with my buddy Quill. So Josh, Chris, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and all the best for your Quest 2 launch. Really excited to see how it goes.
Cool. Thanks, Trent.
Thanks, Trent.
Yep. And you too.